He's a member of the Basel class of 1956. And he received his BA and MA in philosophy from Catholic University, and then his STL from the Catholic University of America in 1960. Received his PhD from Louvain in 1963, and a postdoctoral degree at Louvain, le 9 maître agrégé de l'école Saint-Thomas d'Aquin in May of 1981. He's been a professor at CUA for the last 54 years, and has also served as university provost and academic vice president. He is the recipient of dozens of awards and honors, including the Aquinas Medal, appointment to the Pontifical Academy of St. Thomas Aquinas, and president of numerous philosophical and theological societies. He's authored over 10 books and published over 100 articles, and likewise remains a frequent visitor and very good friend of theological colleges. So that's Senior Wippel.
Thank you for that introduction, Father Brown, and it's a pleasure for me to be here today, also in honor of Theodore Basildon, and I certainly am deeply grateful to him for his foresight in having set up this program, because my coming here as the Basildon was certainly a turning point in my whole life, as it turns out. Probably the most important thing, short of my ordination to the priesthood, as far as, let's say, my subsequent career as a priest and as a scholar would be. So I am indeed very, very grateful to him and for the program that he set up, and for the Sulpician Fathers then for having also played a major role then in the perpetuation of this arrangement with the Catholic University of America. I was asked for a title for this paper, so I took the title of the section, "What is philosophy and why is it important in seminary formation?" And then I added historical philosophical reflections, because this is a method that we frequently use here in our School of Philosophy, namely by drawing upon the history of philosophy in order then to develop our own philosophical thinking and to develop likewise systematic philosophy. So just looking at that title there, I see that we have two distinct but related questions. So the first is, what is philosophy? And then the second is, why is it important in seminary formation? So I've divided my paper into two corresponding parts. Part one dealing with the first question, part two dealing with the second, followed by some concluding remarks. So part one, what is philosophy? In itself, this seems to be a very simple question, and one to which one should be able to give a correspondingly simple answer. But as we reflect about this question, and as we consider the work of other thinkers who have reflected on it, we find that the answer is not quite so simple, and we've heard a great deal about that already from Dr. Sokolowski in his opening remarks here, in his opening talk. But I would begin here by citing a German Catholic scholar and philosopher named Joseph Pieper. He managed to preserve his Catholic faith and his philosophical reason during the entire Nazi period in Germany. And in 1947, just 2 years after the conclusion of World War II, he also addressed this question, and the work translated into English, as some of you probably remember, under the title, Leisure, the Basis of Culture. And there, while discussing the act of philosophizing, he points out how different philosophy is from other academic disciplines. He mentions that a physicist may offer a brief description of his discipline at the very beginning, and then go on to practice the science of physics very successfully without bothering to address the question, what is physics, any further? Or he might not address the question, what is physics, until the very end, and then add it as a kind of postscript to his work. But unlike physics and unlike other particular human sciences and arts, one cannot simply begin to answer the question, what is philosophy, without engaging implicitly, at least, in the act of philosophizing itself. This is because even in asking such a question, one is already implicitly acknowledging and recognizing a number of important philosophical characteristics of oneself as a questioning being. For instance, one is acknowledging by asking the question that human beings can ask questions. And that in itself implies that a human being has a nature that enables one to raise questions. It also implies that such a human being can use words or language, and use words and language to express thoughts, and hence that such a person can think, and therefore that such a person must have a mind or intellect. Moreover, the fact that one can raise such questions implies that one can hope for answers to such questions, and hence that one wants to know the truth of the matter. Even so, Pieper is well known for having proposed a preliminary answer to the question, what is philosophy? And his answer was rather remarkable at a time when he and his countrymen were faced with a challenging project of rebuilding their heavenly bound cities, their destroyed factories, and of striving desperately to provide for the most basic necessities of life, including food, shelter, clothing, eating, not to mention rebuilding their nation's economic and political infrastructure in order to enable it to rejoin the family of productive nations. Nevertheless, or nonetheless, I should say, without in any way minimizing the urgency of the challenging work at hand in rebuilding their nation, Pieper found it necessary to remind his fellow countrymen that there are certain other things that should also be pursued in any civilized society. Things that are not justified by their ability to contribute to the satisfaction of their basic physical needs, but which are of value in and of themselves, and worthy of being pursued for their own sake. And so, as a preliminary description of one of these, philosophy itself, Pieper proposes, to philosophize is to act in such a way that one steps out of the workaday world. By the workaday world, he means the world where what one does is justified only insofar as it contributes to satisfying in some way the basic needs of everyday living, the common necessities of life. And once these are secured, the improvement of the material conditions required for good living. In addition to such things, Pieper insists that there are other goods or values that are to be sought for their own sake, and not merely for some pragmatic or utilitarian purpose. In addition to philosophy, he mentions religion, art, poetry, and even what he calls existential shocks, such as love or death. But I would like to point out here, philosophy is unique in that it involves the pursuit of knowledge and truth for its own sake. It is an effort on the part of human beings to satisfy a fundamental desire that, according to Aristotle, is built into human beings. The desire to understand, the desire to know, simply for the sake of knowing. As Aristotle puts it at the beginning of his Metaphysics, all human beings, by nature, desire to know. As Aristotle looks back upon earlier human history, he proposes that at first human beings concentrated on meeting those basic necessities of life. But as they gradually succeeded in providing for these, they turned to more complex and to greater issues. And they developed sciences that are directed neither to satisfying the basic necessities of life, nor to pleasure. And he mentions specifically mathematics. Aristotle adds that it was assumed that what is called wisdom is concerned with first causes and principles, and that the theoretical sciences are more learned even than the productive kinds of knowledge, such as art and poetry. He also argues that earlier thinkers gradually came to realize that knowledge or understanding, what Aristotle there describes as wisdom, involves the knowledge of things in terms of their causes. Only when someone knows the causes or principles of something will one understand why that thing is, and not merely that it is. And after distinguishing between a knowledge that is practical or productive and that which is purely theoretical, Aristotle proposes that the theoretical kinds of knowledge are superior to the productive and practical type, and share more fully in wisdom. Later on, in Book 6 of the same work, the work we know as the Metaphysics, he divides the theoretical sciences into physics, or philosophy of nature, mathematics, and what he there calls first philosophy, or divine science. And he wants to identify that first philosophy, or divine science, with the science of being, as he had worked this out in Book 4 of the Metaphysics, chapters 1 and 2. In order to provide some filling, as it were, about this wisdom or philosophy of which Aristotle is speaking in Book 1 of the Metaphysics, in its second chapter he turns to common opinion about the characteristics of a wise person. He singles out 6 such characteristics, and then of a wise person, and then applies each one of these to wisdom itself. First of all, he says such a person should have a knowledge of all things. In other words, a universal kind of knowledge, without having to know each thing in terms of its individual characteristics. Hence, wisdom itself, he argues, is a knowledge that is universal, rather than directed to this or that individual. And I would note he brings that out especially well when he talks about the science of being as being, the studies being taken universally, rather than from any more particular perspective. Secondly, he writes, a wise person can learn things that are more difficult to understand. And this is especially true of knowledge of universals, rather than of mere knowledge of individuals. So this again points to the universal character of wisdom, or of the philosophy that he is here describing. Third, one who is wise has a more precise, a more exact knowledge. And this, says Aristotle, is true of the knowledge of things in terms of their first principles and causes, and hence that must be a characteristic of wisdom. Fourth, he says, it is thought that the wise person can teach others. And once again, it is a knowledge of principles and causes that enables one to teach. Hence, once again, that must be characteristic of wisdom. Fifth, he says that knowledge of that which is desirable in and of itself, rather than for the sake of something else, shares more fully in the nature of wisdom. And so once again, knowledge of first principles and causes is a mark of wisdom, for it is through these and from these that other things come to be known. Finally, he writes that the wise person is one who should give orders or commands rather than be commanded. And so too, he says, a higher science shares more fully in the nature of wisdom than a subordinate science. And because wisdom knows for what end each thing must be done, this kind of knowledge is the most authoritative among the sciences. Such an end, says Aristotle, is the good, not only in this or that particular class of things, but the good in the whole of nature. In summing up, he applies all of these characteristics to wisdom, and thus to what later generations would call metaphysics. So he says it's a knowledge that is universal, a knowledge of things in terms of first principles and causes, a knowledge of the good in each class, and finally a knowledge of the good or the end of the entire universe. And for Aristotle, that means it will involve a knowledge of the ultimate final cause of the universe, which will be God, or the unmoved mover, as he describes this in Book 12 of the Metaphysics. Finally, in his discussion of wisdom in Book 1, Aristotle states that this kind of knowledge springs from what he calls wonder. He writes that it is from wonder that human beings first began to philosophize, and it is from wonder that they do so now. And then he writes, and I quote, he's saying, evidently then, we do not seek it, namely this knowledge for the sake of any other advantage, but as the man is free, we say, who exists for himself and not for another, so we pursue this as the only free science, for it alone exists for itself. End of quote. Here again we are reminded of Peter, who also speaks and writes of wonder and of its role in philosophizing. Or if I may return to his preliminary description of philosophy, he writes that it is a sense of wonder that prompts human beings to step out of the workaday world. And we might add, it is wonder that prompts us to seek for answers to what we may call ultimate questions. Questions that thinking beings should raise. For instance, why is there anything at all, rather than nothing whatsoever? Or to personalize our questions a little, we may ask ourselves, who am I? What kind of being am I? From whence did I come? What should I do in order to live properly? What is my ultimate goal in life? What happens after death? Finally, we may ask, is there an ultimate cause, a creative cause, and a final cause of everything else in the universe? And I should add that in addition to theoretical philosophy, which Aristotle has here been describing primarily, he also recognized the need for and the great value of practical philosophy, including ethics and politics, as he brings out very well in two works bearing those very titles, the Nicomachean Ethics and the Politics. And Bob Sokolowski has already told us a great deal about the philosophy's ability to contribute both to ethics and the politics. Now, I've singled out Aristotle in particular, not only because of the importance of his effort to tell us what wisdom is, but also because in him we are dealing with someone who had not benefited from biblical revelation, or to put it another way, with someone who was following the path of reason alone in raising and in attempting to answer such ultimate questions. Aristotle, of course, was not the first to engage in such a pursuit based on reason alone. This was true of many of the pre-Socratic philosophers who came before him, and of Socrates himself, and of Plato. Aristotle, however, finds all of their attempts basically to answer such questions incomplete. Hence, since none of them arrived at knowledge of all four of the causes Aristotle himself discovered, but all were relying on human reason in their philosophical investigations. And this brings me to part two then. Why is philosophy important for seminary formation? With the rise of Christianity, a new dimension entered into human discussion of such ultimate questions, based, of course, on a very different source of knowledge, divine revelation. The recognition of such a source was already present in Judaism with the Old Testament, and we find some attempt at bringing religious faith and philosophical wisdom together in some way in the Jewish philosopher Philo of Alexandria, in the years immediately before and after the life of Jesus of Nazareth. Philo lived from 39 before Christ to 40 AD. But with the spread of the Christian religion to the Gentiles, it was inevitable that as philosophically learned pagans converted to Christianity, or as educated Christians also turned to philosophy, questions would be raised about how religious faith and philosophical wisdom might coexist within the same person. As you all know, different ways of reacting to this challenge developed over the course of time. And to repeat, the challenge is to reconcile what we as Christians accept because of our religious faith with what we may discover on the grounds of philosophical reason. While I cannot go into each of these reactions in any great detail here, I will simply recall a helpful introduction to this issue published in 1938 by Etienne Gilson in a little book entitled Reason and Revelation in the Middle Ages, which itself was based on a series of lectures he gave at the University of Virginia. Gilson divides his book into 3 parts, each dealing with one major way of resolving this issue. That is to say, one might first assert the primacy of faith, or second, one might assert the primacy of reason. Or third, one might attempt to defend some harmony, an ultimate harmony between faith and reason. As an early example of the first reaction, the primacy of faith, Gilson singles out the early Christian writer Tertullian, and he examines what he calls the Tertullian family. As Gilson summarizes the characteristics of this group, he notes that for them revelation had been given to men as a substitute for all other knowledge, including science, ethics, and metaphysics. And since God has spoken to us, it is no longer necessary for us to think. End of quote from Gilson. Tertullian and those of his family loved to cite certain texts from St. Paul. For instance, Romans 1:22, where in referring to the Greeks, Paul writes, and I quote, "Professing themselves to be wise, they became fools." But members of this family omit references to Romans 1:20, where Paul acknowledges that the Greeks had reason from the visible things of this world to knowledge of the invisible things of God. Now, Tertullian was a very powerful writer, and also an accomplished rhetorician, and also a very forceful apologetic for the Catholic faith until he fell into heresy. And we can gather this from the following remark taken from his treatise on prescription against heretics. And I will quote this, it's a famous quotation. "What indeed has Athens to do with Jerusalem? What concord is there between the academy and the church? What between heretics and Christians?" So on the one side there, you see we have Athens, and then the academy, and then heretics. And then on the other side we have Jerusalem and the church and Christians. And then he goes on to say, "Away with all attempts to produce a model Christianity of Stoic, Platonic, and dialectic composition. We want no curious disputation after possessing Christ Jesus, no inquisition after enjoying the gospel. We desire no further belief, for this is our faith, that there is nothing which we ought to believe besides." End of quote. Now, Gilson finds traces of this family in the medieval period in St. Bernard of Clairvaux, who refers to those who call themselves philosophers, but in his own opinion should rather be called the slaves of curiosity and pride. End of quote. And in St. Peter Damian, Gilson finds a more vicious attack on dialectics, grammar, and all that involved relying on natural reason. But I would note here, going beyond Gilson, that Peter Damian also reveals considerable dialectical skill himself, especially in one of his very long letters, number 119, which is really a treatise. There, against the dialecticians of his day, he considers and finally defends the view that because of his omnipotence, God could make the past not to have been if he should so choose. Hence, he could make it to be the case that the city of Rome never existed. That is a strong position. In any event, Gilson finds a more positive version of the primacy of faith family in St. Augustine, recalling his invitation for one to begin with one's faith and then to understand, thereby avoiding the long and difficult search for truth he himself had undergone during his youth, including about 10 years in embracing Manichaeism, then for a short time skepticism, then Neoplatonism, which, finally aided by St. Ambrose's preaching at Milan, led Augustine to his conversion to Christianity. Augustine's advice for others, then, was to reverse this procedure and to begin with one's faith, and then to seek understanding of that faith. This understanding could, and for him did, lead to a philosophical understanding of some of the truths he believed about God and divine things. And I would note an excellent illustration of this can be found in Book 2 of his treatise on free choice, De Libero Arbitrio. There, setting aside his belief in the existence of God, he develops a long and philosophically rich argument for God's existence based on our knowledge of eternal truths, eternal verities. In the Middle Ages, this approach would be revived and reinforced by St. Anselm's call upon the Christians of his day first to believe and then seek to understand. We see this especially, for instance, in his Monologion and in his known argumentation for God's existence in his Proslogion. While Gilson places the Augustinian family under the primacy of faith, here I would introduce a distinction. Augustine and Anselm do indeed defend the chronological primacy of faith for the religious believer, in that they recommend that one should first believe and then only seek to understand and to philosophize. But they do not think that faith and reason are opposed to one another. So if we were to adopt what we might call a timeless perspective, then I think we could place them under Gilson's third general family, namely those defending harmony between reason and revelation. But at the same time, I must acknowledge the Augustinian approach can very easily lead to a blurring of the distinction between philosophy and theology. But if every extreme position seems to find its opposite, the same seems to have happened in the history of this issue. And so in chapter 2 of his book, Gilson singles out a second family that defends the primacy of reason when comparing faith and reason. And for an illustration of this, he turns to the world of Islam and to the 12th century philosopher Averroes, who lived from 1126 to 1198. Averroes devoted much of his career to writing a whole series of commentaries on the works of Aristotle, and he was destined to have considerable influence in the Latin-speaking world in the 13th and early 14th centuries, and still again in Italy during the early Renaissance. Islam also had its sacred book, the Quran, and at the same time, Muslim thinkers had access to a wealth of ancient philosophical writings, especially by Aristotle, but also by other Greek thinkers, that had been translated into Arabic from manuscripts found in the libraries of some of the lands conquered by Islam. Indeed, for a number of centuries, while almost all of Aristotle's writings and most of those like Plato remained unavailable to the Latin-speaking West, Islamic philosophers had access to a much richer philosophical library. As a consequence, important Islamic philosophers appeared, such as Al-Kindi, Al-Farabi, and above all, Avicenna, and then Averroes. Averroes, as well as Avicenna, would exercise considerable influence in the Latin West because of the translations of many of their major works into Latin in the late 12th and the early 13th centuries. And not surprisingly, they too had to face the faith reason problem. In a work entitled The Decisive Treatise, or On the Agreement of Religion and Philosophy, Averroes presents his solution. He seems to have been hopeful of convincing the Islamic theologians of his time that there should be no real conflict between faith and reason if each understands and remains within its own proper place. According to Averroes, instead of condemning philosophical investigation, the Quran positively prescribes it, for it commands human beings to study the natures of things, so that they can rise from knowledge of these to a knowledge of God. But, says Averroes, one cannot philosophize out of nothing, and so one should turn back to Greek philosophy, and in studying the world of nature, reason to the existence of God. But in order to reason properly, one must reason correctly. And so again, according to Averroes, one should turn back to the Greeks who invented logic, the study of logic. Again, according to Averroes, all of this follows from the Quran's command. Then Averroes takes from Aristotle the distinction between rhetorical, dialectical, and demonstrative argumentation. The majority of human beings can understand and be persuaded only by rhetorical argumentation, he writes. They cannot reach higher modes of understanding. They are guided by their imagination rather than by reason. And so one must appeal to images and persuasive speech in order to move them to correct behavior. The Quran, as interpreted by great preachers, is designed to reach them and to persuade them to behave in an acceptable and civilized manner. But there's a second group of human beings who are more intelligent. They will not be satisfied by merely rhetorical argumentation. They want reasons for the things they believe, but they are incapable of reaching and understanding demonstrative argumentation. Hence, they can only develop dialectical, that is to say, probable arguments for the positions they hold, even though they mistakenly think they have demonstrated those conclusions. And according to Averroes, these are the Muslim theologians. Not surprising, I might comment, Averroes did have difficulty with the Muslim theologians. And at times they exercised enough influence upon the local political authority that he was exiled at least once, but he survived. Also, according to Averroes, there is another much smaller group of human beings who can arrive at demonstrative argumentation. These are the philosophers. When it comes to interpreting the Quran, so long as what is found there, when taken literally, does not contradict what the philosophers have discovered, there is no problem. But if a contradiction arises between the literal meaning of a text in the Quran and the philosophically demonstrated conclusion, then the Quran should be reinterpreted allegorically by someone. But the only person qualified to do this is one who understands all three levels of argumentation. And of course, that person is the philosopher, according to Averroes. Here is where Averroes' rationalism takes over. So it's not the theologians who should interpret Scripture in cases of conflict, but the philosophers. And so in Averroes we have a medieval version of a kind of rationalism, or of a primacy of reason, that we often associate with certain thinkers from the Enlightenment and then subsequent modern and contemporary philosophy. I would note that this particular writing by Averroes was not translated into Latin in the High Middle Ages, but many of the works in which Averroes presents his understanding of Aristotle's thought, and that for him was identical with philosophical truth, many of these works were translated into Latin in the early 13th century, and so they were available to 13th century thinkers and those who would come after them. Eventually, certain Christian professors of philosophy and faculties of arts in the newly founded universities of Europe, especially at Paris, became so enamored of the recently translated Greek and Arabic philosophical texts that some of them defended positions that contradicted Orthodox Christian faith. Names such as Msgr of Brabant and Boethius of Dacia come to mind especially, but there were many others. This in turn led to considerable controversy in the 1260s and 1270s at Paris, at the University of Paris, and thereafter among Christian thinkers, and to some condemnations, especially by the Bishop of Paris in 1270, and then a wholesale condemnation of 220 propositions by that same bishop in 1277. Fortunately, however, another approach to the faith-reason problem was developed, especially at this time, by St. Thomas Aquinas. And that defends harmony between reason and revelation. Thus, excuse me. Well, some of Aquinas' contemporaries would also attempt to bring faith and reason into an appropriate relationship. Not all did so with equal success. Indeed, the clearest defense of harmony between faith and reason of which I am aware was worked out by Thomas himself. This is especially so in his text taken from his commentary on the De Trinitate of Boethius in question 2, article 3, a text that needs to be more widely known. Thomas there develops his solution in answering this question. Whether in the science of faith, that is to say, whether in theology, which deals with God, it is permissible to use philosophical arguments and authorities. In beginning his response, Thomas notes that the gifts of grace are added to nature, not so as to destroy nature, but rather in order to perfect it. As a Christian, Aquinas believed that original sin had indeed weakened our natural powers of intellect and will, but he did not believe that human nature had been intrinsically corrupted. And that's a very important point. It distinguishes Thomas very sharply from the entire Lutheran tradition, or Martin Luther in particular. And so in the present text he continues by observing that the light of faith, which is given to us as a grace, does not destroy the light of natural reason, which has also been instilled in us by God, our Creator. While Thomas recognizes that the natural light of the human mind is incapable of discovering revealed mysteries, such as the Trinity or the Incarnation, he insists that those truths that we can accept on the grounds of faith cannot be contrary to those that we may discover by using natural reason. This is, so he reasons, because both kinds of truth ultimately come to us from God as the author of revelation on the one hand, and from that same God as the creator of our intellects on the other hand. If the intellect is rightly used, it can discover then philosophically knowable truth. So to say that there could be contradiction between these two kinds of truth would be to make God himself the author of falsity. And of course, Thomas rejects that as impossible. Thomas then turns explicitly to theology, Sacra Doctrina, and philosophy. Just as theology is grounded on the light of faith, so philosophy is grounded on the natural light of reason. Therefore, it's impossible for those things that belong to philosophy to be contrary to those that are accepted on faith, even though the former falls short of the mysteries accepted only by faith. Indeed, Thomas continues, those truths that pertain to philosophy contain certain likenesses of and certain preambles to the truths of faith. So here also the ultimate reason for defending a harmony between philosophical truths and truths of faith is that both come to us from one and the same source, God himself. Thomas himself was not naive, however, and immediately acknowledges that some conclusions defended by some philosophers do contradict truths given to us by divine revelation. In these cases, he says that such conclusions are not properly philosophical. He says rather they stem from an abuse of philosophy following from a misuse of reason. And so in such cases, he continues, it is possible by using the principles of philosophy, and I'd like to repeat that. He says it is possible then by using the principles of philosophy to refute such alleged philosophical conclusions in one of two ways. Either first by demonstrating that they are impossible, that they are false, or else second by showing that they themselves have not been demonstrated. Now he makes this rather subtle distinction because an alleged philosophical conclusion might contradict something that is contained in or implied by revelation, but which can also be demonstrated by natural reason. Excuse me. Thomas refers to these as preambles of faith, and he cites various examples of them in different contexts. But he always begins, number one, with the existence of God, and number two, with the fact that there is only one God. Now, in such a case, if someone is contradicting that kind of truth, Thomas says then one can demonstrate that the alleged philosophical conclusion that contradicts revealed truth is simply false. For the philosopher can demonstrate, for instance, the existence of God against someone who claims to have demonstrated that God does not exist. And I can think of two, I won't name them, but one of whom I knew very well was a friend of mine, but who back about 1950 wrote articles proving that God does not exist. So that type of rationalism is still with us. So Thomas goes on to say, if a philosopher claims that he has demonstrated the non-existence of God, one can demonstrate the opposite. As I've said, by proving that God does exist. But supposing the alleged philosophical conclusion contradicts a revealed mystery, such as the Trinity or the Incarnation. Here, Thomas writes, one cannot demonstrate the falsity of that philosophical claim, for then one would in effect demonstrate the truth of the revealed mystery itself. That's because a negation of a negation is an affirmation. But, says Thomas, one can show that the alleged demonstration that claims to contradict faith is not in fact itself a demonstration. So Thomas concludes then by indicating three different ways in which one may use philosophy in one's theology. First, to demonstrate those preambles of faith, and he describes them this way. He says that it is necessary to know them in one's act of faith, such as those that are proved by natural arguments about God, such as that God exists, or that God is one, and other truths of this kind concerning God or concerning creatures that are proved in philosophy and that faith presupposes. End of truth. So that is his description of a preamble of faith. So that's a very important part then of his answer to the faith reason question. Secondly, he says, in theology, one may also use philosophical arguments to manifest, but not to demonstrate, certain truths of faith by drawing upon certain likenesses taken from the teaching of philosophers in order to illuminate something found, let's say, in Revelation. And Thomas says this is what Augustine does frequently in his book on the Trinity. He has in mind something like this there, for instance, that Augustine would refer to intellect and will and memory, for instance, as being three, and yet to the fact that there is only one soul. So that is a more sophisticated version, I suppose, of St. Patrick's Army about the Shamrock. But in any event, it's that type of, it's not a demonstration. But then thirdly, Thomas says, one can also use then philosophy in order to resist attacks against the faith in either of the two ways I've already singled out. But he also points out two ways in which one can fall into error when one uses philosophy in one's theologizing, either by using bad philosophy, as, says Thomas, Origen did, or else by refusing to believe anything that has not been demonstrated philosophically. In other words, by falling into rationalism. Now, as you've already gathered, I myself regard this third solution as most suitable in itself and also most suitable for the formation of seminarians. That is to say, the position that defends harmony between reason and revelation, and also harmony between philosophy and theology. And I've already indicated that I think that Aquinas' explanation of this is the best that is to be found. But I would also note that he is singled out for very special attention by Pope John Paul II in his encyclical Fides et Ratio, even though he doesn't use the terminology preambles of faith there. But he does cite a text from Thomas, Campus Gentiles, Book 1, Chapter 7, and then the prima pars of the Summa Theologiae, Question 1, Article 8, Part 2. And I might add that in the book recently published by Pope Benedict on Great Christian Thinkers, in his chapter on Thomas Aquinas, when he deals with this issue, he does follow the text from the commentary on the De Trinitate, which I've been using here myself. This brings me to my concluding remarks. As regards the importance of philosophy for the formation of seminarians, I would note that in today's society, priests are expected to have received a well-rounded education, and one that prepares them to deal with human beings from every walk of life, and with varying degrees of education. In the United States today, they may at times come into contact with very highly educated parishioners. That's especially likely in a suburban area such as the present one, where there's a very high percentage of college graduates. And in fact, some of those parishioners may have advanced degrees, including doctorates, in their respective fields. It seems to me that a strong background in the liberal arts and the humanities should be a necessary part of the educational background of candidates for the priesthood, and precisely because, if I may return to Aristotle, philosophy is the most liberal of all human disciplines, of purely human disciplines. So it ought to be included in the educational background of any liberally educated human being, for it involves a search for truth as an end worthy of pursuit in itself, and as something that is good in itself. Second, a strong background in philosophy, including logic and systematic courses such as metaphysics, philosophy of nature, and so forth, should help students to think logically and to organize their thoughts coherently, both in their conversations with others and in preparing papers during their times as students in theology, and above all, I would add, in their future homilies, in preparing their homilies. This concern about preparing for and delivering good homilies was a very important motive behind Theodore Bazin's creation of the Bazin Scholarship Program here at Catholic University, as one can read in the life of Theodore Bazin. So that's especially mentioned, and likewise in his will. Third, priests in today's world are going to come into contact with Catholics and non-Catholics. And among the non-Catholics, there will be Christians and non-Christians. Among the non-Christians, there will be followers of other religions and many who have no religion. And among those who have no religion, there will be some who believe in God, a God of some kind, some who are agnostic, and some who are atheists. Now, as Thomas Aquinas himself recognized when he was beginning to write his Summa Contra Gentiles, he wanted to address unbelievers, including Christian heretics and non-Christians, and among the latter, Jews and Muslims. Today, I think Thomas would undoubtedly add to that list agnostics and atheists. Or they could appeal to the Old and New Testaments in dealing with Christian heretics, and at least to the Old Testament when addressing Jews. He could appeal to neither of these in the case of Muslims. Therefore, in an effort to reach all of these kinds of unbelievers, In the first 3 of the 4 books of the Summa Contra Gentiles, he decided to use philosophical argumentation and reasoning throughout, because only by an appeal to rational arguments could he reach all of them. It was only in Book 4 that he would take up a discussion of divine things, insofar as they are revealed to us by God and contained in Scripture. In today's secularized society, an ability to converse with Christians and non-Christians, with believers and non-believers, will be very important for our future priests. Once again, then, the solid formation in philosophy should be an essential part of seminary formation today. And here I would note that this philosophical formation should not only include metaphysics, ethics, as Sokolowski has brought out so well, and other systematic courses, but also a first-hand knowledge of texts from major philosophers taken from the ancient, medieval, modern, and contemporary periods. And I might add, by the way, after students have learned how to read those philosophers from those different periods as well, they should also be able to almost read any kind of text which is placed before them. It should enable them to become very good at interpreting texts. Fourth, as everyone knows, a sound theological formation is absolutely essential for today's candidates for the priesthood. So I trust all of you would grant that. At least I hope so. But in any event, the Church has long recognized that a sound background in philosophy is required for people to have a sound theological formation. And my historical remarks were also intended to remind ourselves how greatly one's philosophy can influence one's theologizing. Aquinas himself has remarked that mistakes in theology often go back to mistakes in the kind of philosophy utilized by erring theologians. To put it positively, solid theological formation presupposes a solid theological formation presupposes a solid philosophical formation. As Aquinas has noted, a theologian can, should use philosophy in working out his or her theology, and first and foremost by turning to it in order to establish on philosophical grounds the preambles of faith. And more than that, in a theologian's effort to understand and explain mysteries of faith, philosophical reasoning has often been employed in theological argumentation, and rightly so long as the philosophy being used is appropriate for that task. Fides et Ratio, Pope John Paul II has identified a number of characteristics that should be present in the kind of philosophy that is utilized by the theologian in carrying out the theologian's task. Especially he singles out, in the case of dogmatic theology, fundamental theology, and moral theology. Another requirement for today's student of the priesthood is to be aware of and to arrive at, personally, a balanced response to the faith-reason problem. Here I can only recall what I've already said in recommending especially Aquinas' solution to that issue. This is necessary especially when one is dealing not only with non-Catholics, but I would suggest also with certain Catholics who seem to live in a kind of intellectual and moral schizophrenia, thinking that they can be faithful Catholics in church on Sunday, and yet can put their religion on the shelf when it comes to their everyday lives, to their professional lives, and I might add, to their political lives. They could profit from reading a little more from Aquinas, or from some of his followers, or from Fides et Ratio. There are surely other good reasons for including a strong program in philosophy in the formation of seminarians, and Bob Sokolowski has touched on many of those, but I must stop here. Perhaps some of you may mention one or more of these during our discussion. Thank you for your attention.
Monsignor Wippel, I want to thank you on behalf of all of us for an equally erudite and thought-provoking presentation this morning. And so at this time, I'd like to open up the floor for any questions or comments. And Isabella Downs, our development manager, has a portable microphone that she'd like to offer to whoever has a question or comment, so that we'll be able to hear you clearly. And I'll kind of also help to moderate the questions if it's needed. If you would please identify yourself first, and then also let us know to whom you are directing your question or your comment, whether Monsignor Sokolowski, Monsignor Wippel, or both.
Hi, Bob Weber. Nice to see you again, John. Bob. Talking about clarity and causes and wisdom, I was thinking of a modern phenomenon. People talking about eliminating world hunger. And I was thinking, why would you want to eliminate hunger? Hunger is a good human mechanism that's been developed to alert people to the fact that they need food and so forth. It's like fever or pain even. These are unpleasant things, but they are important mechanisms to alert us. And it seems like, though, that the advertising industry is telling us to alleviate symptoms rather than causes. The big thing is to eliminate insomnia or aches and pains. And it seems to me that we should be in the forefront in alerting people and providing some clarity in saying, you know, we don't want to eliminate symptoms, we want to get to causes. So I think this is what philosophy can provide, and it's getting to be more and more important because there's a carelessness or a lack of focus on what is really worth investigating and dealing with.
Actually, I think I agree with you. So I think that's a very good illustration of maybe some distinctions. The distinctions are appropriate here. So there's a distinction between a symptom and a cause. That's a very important distinction.
It's a matter of speaking clearly and of, not using cliches. I think what you referred to, people just repeat those things. In fact, I just put together 3 that are used an awful lot now. Namely, we'll take boots on the we'll put boots on the ground and throw them under the bus because they don't fit the narrative. I made my statement. But it's like what you say. Words are used, and they're extremely indistinct in what they signify. But I think the proliferation of media adds to that. How many good things can one say if you've got to talk for many hours on the TV or radio or whatever? So that is the degeneration of language. Apparently, Ezra Pound always said that Confucius, some emperor in China decreed that from now on all the words will be, the meaning of all words will be clarified. That was a kind of edict. And I would agree with you that would be a good thing to do.
Peter Backwich, Basel in 1970. Currently in the School of Philosophy, I think there's like 3 groups. There's the students who are studying philosophy as philosophy majors and not intending to go on to the priesthood. There are those who are coming in at a later time for vocations and coming for the pre-theology philosophy, and then there are the Basilans. Theoretically or practically, is there a difference in the philosophy that's offered and studied by the 3 groups? Either one can answer.
Well, I think a lot of the classes overlap. The dean, in effect, would explain that most.
Well, the Basilan program, as most of you know, the Basilan program, as most of you know, is a 3-year program. So the 2 years of the last 2 years of an undergraduate degree, and then 1 year for the master's or licentiate. So the pre-theology students won't do that. They typically come for up to 10 courses only in philosophy. That's required by the 5th edition of the program of priestly formation of the bishops of the United States. So those 10 courses will by and large overlap with the 10 of the 14 undergraduate courses that the Basilans would take. Lay students coming in will typically do the 14 courses in the undergraduate major that the Basilans would do. So a lot of overlap.
There's an awful lot of courses that are for the freshmen and sophomores too, where you have very many students enrolled. The ones who are specialized within the school, like the majors or the pre-theology, are only a part of the whole program. Much of what we do is for the general college population as well.
Yes. Thank you so much for the wonderful talks. I'm Father Tom Quist from Chicago, Basel class of 80, I think it was. There's two words that are chock-filled with a lot of meaning that are very popular, that have a lot of force going on, and I find myself a little uncomfortable with both of them. There's something good about them, but there's something missing about them, and I'd love to hear your reaction.